Want to animate your chibis in After Effects? Let me show you how I did it. So I didn't record anything while I was working on this, but I'll just show you my file here and tell you what I did. Before you start animating, you're gonna have to cut up your drawing so that it's ready to be animated. So you can see here I've separated each element that I plan to animate into its own layer, and within these pre-comps, we have separate layers as well. And you're going to want to also extend each element so that they overlap a little bit. You can see that this hair kind of extends into the second section just so that you have room to distort it as needed. Layer order is going to be pretty important here because obviously you want things that are in the front to appear in the front. So when you're cutting your drawing up, you want to think about it in terms of what's in the front versus what's in the back, rather than splitting it up by object. So for example, you can see here that the front of the hat is separate from the back of the hat because we'll need to distort them separately to make it look convincing. And this is because when I think of rotating an object in 3D space, the front and the back of the object are actually moving in opposite directions. So for example, when I rotate this eraser, the back end of the eraser is actually moving to the left, while the front is moving to the right. So separating your object into front and back will let you move or distort them in opposite directions. You can kind of apply this concept to anything you want to rotate. So for example, the head nods here, all I did was move the ears and facial features in opposite directions of each other. You can see that if I hide the facial features, the ears are just moving up and down. And it's the same is true if I just show the face layer. They're just moving up and down, but just in the opposite direction of the ears. But when you combine this motion together, it looks like it's nodding even without any additional complex distortions. Just moving things in opposite directions can give you a pretty good base to work with, but if you want it to look a little more convincing, you can apply a slight distortion. So generally, when objects move from the foreground to the background, they appear smaller, and the opposite is also true. So I applied a mesh warp to distort the facial features, larger or smaller depending on the rotation, and the distortion is quite subtle, but it just depends on how much your face is rotating. You can see the difference that this makes when the effect is turned on or off. I just think that it makes the rotation look a little more convincing. So that's the basics of how you can create an animation like this one. Obviously the distortions here are quite simple because chibis have a very simple body structure. When you get to objects with more complex structure like this one, for example, the distortions will naturally become a little more complex, but the concept remains the same. You might just have to think about cutting up your drawing in different ways so you have a little more control. Just play around with it. It's really fun to play around and experiment on After Effects, and seeing the final results is always really satisfying. So I hope this inspires you to experiment a little bit with your art.